Welcome back. As I reflected on what we covered for Unit 2, I was reminded of an article that came out recently where it says that approximately $500 million was spent by Jamaicans on OnlyFans. And it brought to mind the whole concept of the NI statistics, national income statistics, and their limitations. And I've decided to have another look at what these limitations are so that we can have a more fulsome understanding of how to treat with these situations and what the rationales are. So $500 million has been spent on OnlyFans. The question is, how did we know that? Has that been recorded in terms of the government accounts? And the answer is no. So as we dig deeper into the story, we realize that it's an organization that is out there that does some sort of web scraping, and based on that, they're able to make these reports. And the point that we're making here is NI statistics does not account for the hidden economy. There are several transactions which take place within the economy which are not recorded on the books of the country. For example, pornography, selling of illicit drugs, and all other kinds of activities such as those. Additionally, you have other types of activities. For example, a teacher might be doing some teaching on the side. That's not recorded. But is that going to contribute to the economy? And the answer is yes. So what we're saying here is that NI statistics do not account for all the income that is generated within an economy. Also, the NI statistics do not account for the income distribution. So yes, we can calculate GDP, and then we can try and compute the GDP per capita, which means how much persons are contributing towards this GDP. And we do that by doing GDP divided by the population. So you'd have seen a similar calculation where we looked at NNP divided by the population. So one is looking at the income, one is looking at GDP per capita. So when we compute this GDP per capita, it gives an approximation of the contribution by each person within the population. We already know, though, that not everybody within the population is within the workforce. So it therefore means that the information that we get from this is a little bit exaggerated. In addition to that, we know that income is equal to expenditure. And what this says is, based on the income that persons receive, they are going to make some expenditure or use that income to purchase goods and services. What we don't know, though, is what are the percentages of income which are associated with different households. And if a few earned a whole lot, then what it means is that the majority of the persons are not going to have the kind of quality of life that they deserve or desire, because they won't have the spending power to do so. So we don't know how the income is distributed. So that is also problematic. Then we need to talk about environmental issues. The NI statistics do not take this into account, because NI statistics are concerned with the monetary value of the goods and services which have been created. But the question is, at what cost? We have had several situations here in Jamaica where, because of production, the waterways have been polluted. And this seems to be something that reoccurs every maybe 3 to 5 years. So NI statistics does not take this into account. Also, globally, we have heard of things like global warming, which, based on what the scientists are saying, it is brought about by virtue of the productive capacity that has been taking place within the environment. You know, we are burning fossil fuels, etc., and by virtue of that, we are polluting the atmosphere. Another example is we are building all these electronics, but the batteries, once it's time to dispose of them, then there's no adequate way to dispose of them. So we're throwing them into the landfills, etc. And because of that, we are poisoning the earth. So these are things that the NI statistics do not account for. It also does not account for recreation. So if we are measuring productivity based on the quantity of goods and services which have been produced, then what it means is that the more we produce, the more productive we are as a country. And in order to produce more, it implies that we need people to work more. Well, that's one metric, right? The more people work, the more we produce. Or we can get more efficient at producing by using machinery. But let's just use more people, the more people work as our reference point. For example, in the US, we know that persons will have 2 and 3 jobs. And what does that do for your leisure time? What does that do for family time? If you're spending 16, 18 hours, working, what quality of life do you have? NI statistics do not account for that. We also need to talk about the composition of the goods and services which have been produced. And when we mention the composition of the goods and services, we're really talking about what is being produced within the society. So a society that produces, for example, more machinery than it produces food, for example, then the question might be asked, how will the persons within this society get access to food? Because if all the food has to be imported, then obviously that is going to be coming over at a cost. Is it that all the persons who are helping to produce these machinery, is it that they are getting adequate wages so that when the food is imported at this higher cost, that they will be able to purchase these food items? We don't know. And so the composition of goods and services is going to be important in the consideration, because we want to ensure that we have a healthy mix of the goods and services which are being produced locally, so that persons locally are able to avail themselves of these. NI statistics does not take this into account. Then there is the issue of inflation that might not be taken into account depending on how GDP is calculated. Now, just as a reminder, we have nominal GDP, and we have real GDP. Now, nominal GDP is GDP which is calculated at, current prices or market prices. Whereas for real GDP, we want to have a constant unit of measurement. So we want to have a base price that is being used as the measurement. And I'll do a quick demonstration to kind of ensure that we cement the concept. So let's say, for example, we have an economy. Let's say that this is 2024. And in this economy, we sell, let's say, books and shoes. And let's say the books, in terms of the quantity, is 2. In terms of the shoe, it is 1. And the book costs $10. Whereas the shoe costs $20. So this is what we have. And we are now asked to compute GDP. So remember, GDP, or one measure of GDP, is to find the summation, price times quantity of all the final products or the final goods and services which have been created within the economy. So given that our economy only produces book and shoe, then it means that in terms of the computation of GDP, then that is going to be equal to 2 times 10 plus 1 times 20. So working that out, we know that this works out to be 20. And this also works out to be 20. So it means that GDP in this case is going to be $40. So that's in 2024. What if we now move to 2025? And when we are in 2025, we are now told that in terms of the books, the number of books that were created, we created 2. And the number of shoes that were created, we created 1. But the price at which we created the shoe was $15. Whereas, sorry, the book was $15. Whereas the shoe, let's say that that is $30. So what is GDP in 2025? So GDP in 2025 is going to be equal to 2 times 15 plus 1 times 30. So 2 times 15, that's 30. So we have 30 plus 30, which gives us GDP of $60. So if we compare both, so 2025, that's $60. 2024, that's $40. And we ask ourselves, which economy is doing better? Then, well, 60 compared to 40, therefore, would imply that 60 is better. So in 2025, we are doing better. But the truth is, we are not doing better because the quantities which have been produced are the same. It's 2 books in both cases, and it's 1 shoe in both cases. So therefore, productivity has not increased in this economy. And it's for that reason why we want to compute real GDP. Because with nominal GDP, when we look at the value, we don't know, has the value gone up because the quantity produced has increased? Or has the value gone up because the price has increased? And remember, with GDP, what we are trying to do is capture the productivity. How many items have been produced? Are we more productive in terms of creating more stuff within the economy? Meaning we have become more efficient at production. And it's for that reason why we want to compute real GDP so that we can facilitate the comparisons between both economies. So what we are saying here is that within the NI statistics, if we do not account for the GDP calculations correctly, and if we do not account for inflation, then it means that we're going to have limitations in terms of how we can use these values to facilitate comparisons between countries and between periods. I think this naturally leads to the question of how do we now move from nominal GDP to real GDP? And we pretty much do this by saying that GDP, let's call this R for real GDP, is equal to the nominal GDP. So let's call this GDP with an N over some price index times 100. So we're going to divide the nominal GDP by some price index, and we multiply that by 100, and that gives us the real GDP. So I think the question now becomes, well, what exactly is a price index? And a price index, oh, by the way, another word that you'll see being used for price index is going to be a GDP deflator, which I think is a great terminology, because if we think about it, inflation is going to inflate the price or make the prices go up. So what we want to do is we want to deflate those prices. In other words, we want to bring those prices back to the base year price so that we can facilitate the comparison between the two periods. All right, so back to what we were saying. What exactly is the price index, and how do we compute this? One common measure is to use a common basket. So we can say that we have a fixed basket of goods, and we are going to use this basket to determine what the price index is actually going to be. So let's go back to our example that we have for 2024 and 2025 in our example here. Let us assume that 2024 is the base year. So then what we end up with is that the basket price so the basket cost. So the basket cost in 2024 is equal to $40. But the basket cost for 2025 is equal to $60. And so what we want to try and determine is, well, what is the change in terms of what has transpired? So what we can do in this instance is we can have our basket cost for 2025, which is our current cost. So let me just put B 2025, and we divide it by the base. Now in this case, the base is going to be 2024. And we times that by 100. So how does that equate? We have 60 over 40 times 100. So we actually end up with 6 over 4 times 100. And when we do that computation, let me bring up the calculator. So we have 6 divided by 4. And we multiply that by 100. And we end up with 150. So this equals to 150. Now, what we do is we assume that the base cost. So in the base here, we assume that that is 100. So it therefore means that if we're now looking at today's cost, or the cost within the current period, that is now 150. The increase here, therefore, is 50%. So what we have said is that the GDP deflator is the price index, which is 150. And what it means is that the price has been increased by 50%. So just one final thing, in terms of this, let's do some mathematical juggling. So if we are given some GDP deflator, then how do we make use of that? Well, going back to our formula, we want to compute GDP R, and we know that that is equal to GDP N over that deflator or price index times 100. So given that we are in 2025, where we know that the nominal is 60, and we are given that the deflator or the price index is 150. So we say 60 divided by 150 times 100, and that will give us what GDPR in terms of the real cost is, meaning what's GDP without that inflation component that is inside of it. So let's compute that, and we have a look at the result. So that is 60 divided by 150. And when we multiply that by 100, so that's 60 divided by 150. That's 0.4. And then 0.4 times 100. That carries us to 40. So therefore, what we are saying is in 2024, if we look at the GDP, it was $40. And in 2025, GDP that we calculated at the nominal cost was $60. But when we made use of our GDP deflator so that we can keep prices constant, we see that that price of $60 actually equates to $40. So now we can compare across the periods. And we see, therefore, that the GDP in both cases is actually the same. All right, good. So I think that kind of sets some context or give a bit more explanation on what is happening within the economy. which now leads us to the concept of what are the decisions that we can make based on having an appreciation of, the NI statistics. So we can make investment decisions because it will give us an idea of what kind of machinery we need to purchase, because consumer income is going up. Therefore, people are able to buy more. If people are able to buy more, then as the firms, we want to produce more so that they can avail themselves of these products and services. So it will give us an idea in terms of where to make our investments as firms. So what kind of factories to build, what kind of equipment are we going to be focusing on? Which is also similar to the concept of market expansion. So where are we going to open new locations, for example? So we have our KFC store, and we know that we are doing well and people are buying KFC. So the question becomes, what new locations do we need to open up? Or as a local company, like a Grace, for example, which overseas territory are we supposed to go into? Because persons are buying more Jamaican products. So market expansion decisions is also driven by having an idea of what is happening in the economy by virtue of making use of the NI statistics. We also have credit decisions which are going to be made. Banks will determine, what to lend, how much to lend, what the interest rate is going to be based on the signals that they are receiving from these NI statistics. So if people are getting, employed, more people are working, etc., then they are going to be more willing to lend out money. But if the economy is contracting, meaning unemployment is high, then they are going to want to hold back on lending because they are not sure if they are going to get back their money that has been loaned out. NI decisions also impact pricing strategies. So as we look at pricing strategies, we're talking about what happens when inflation occurs. Well, when inflation occurs, then it means that prices will have to increase so that we can absorb what is happening. Also, whenever inflation is low, it means that we want to keep the prices stable, and the general thinking in the economy is that the economy is good, so we are going to spend more. But if prices are rising, then people are going to want to spend less. And if people start to spend less, then it means that this is going to impact the credit decisions. It's going to impact how many things are being created with the economy. So there is a ripple effect based on the signals that you're getting from pricing strategies. And finally, demand forecasting. So just by having a look at what is happening within the economy in terms of unemployment, in terms of persons' income rising and so on, it kind of signals how much demand is going to be within the system. And based on the amount of demand, then that signals to the suppliers or the firms that they need to be supplying more or they need to be supplying less. And this is something that we're going to touch on in Unit 3 when we speak about aggregate demand and aggregate spend and aggregate supply. So this is Unit 2, Part D, so that we could just wrap up everything nicely. And stay tuned now for Unit 3.